At a quick glance, it may seem that there are a lot of mindset similarities between people who are involved with sports cards, who play fantasy sports, and who participate in different forms of sports betting. However, I'm here to suggest that there are actually 3 distinct mindsets for each of these spaces, and that if you approach one of them with the mindset of another one of them, you likely will not do well. Sports cards. In essence, sports cards is a hobby. People approach the hobby in different ways, but at the root of it, the thing that inspires people to stay connected with sports cards year after year is the love of the hobby. Sports card hobbyists very often do hope to make a profit or at least break even, but beyond that, it's a love for sports cards and/or for the sports card community that keeps them into it wherever the wind may blow. But there are 2 approaches to the hobby that are very likely to cause someone's interest in it to eventually flame out, thinking about it like fantasy sports and thinking about it like a gambler. If someone approaches sports cards with a fantasy sports mentality, it's too easy for them to make decisions without awareness of the forces affecting the sports card market that have nothing to do with the sport itself. The economic situation of the world at large influences the market values of sports cards to a very significant degree, but that is something that really matters not at all to a fantasy sports aficionado. Someone into fantasy sports is there for the sport and only the sport. In addition, the person who approaches sports cards with a fantasy sports mentality will very likely look for the undervalued semi-star. A fantasy sports fan may love to find a player for their team who is in a situation that will enable them to do well in a fantasy sports league. Say, for example, Colin Sexton being seemingly the only capable scorer on a terrible Utah Jazz roster, or Fred VanVleet or Drew Holiday being excellent glue guys that would benefit any team. But in the realm of sports cards, those players who are semi-stars, glue guys, and X-Factor type of players very often have cards no more valuable than an end-of-the-bench player. Approaching sports cards with a fantasy sports mentality will very often lead to losing money in sports cards. And since sports cards can be a very expensive hobby to participate in if you aren't at least getting close to breaking even, this is a mentality that can easily lead someone to fade from sports cards over time. Similarly, someone approaching sports cards with a sports betting mentality will also very likely fade from the hobby. Gambling with sports cards is a surefire way to lose. If someone approaches the hobby with a gambler's mentality only, they're approaching it like their cards are lottery tickets. But just like lottery tickets, the majority of those gambles will not pay off. There are 2 main ways that I see people most often participating in the hobby with a gambler's type of mentality. One is by buying and ripping open copious amounts of boxes and packs of cards, looking for that one big hit. This just straight up is scratching off lottery tickets. The vast majority of those packs are going to result in very little value, and the chances of striking it big are similar to that scratch off. The second way that many people gamble with sports cards is by playing the game of rookie prospecting, hoping a young player becomes the next big thing in the league and their cards spike in value. This is also simply a gamble. You don't have to approach rookie prospecting with a gambler's mentality, but a lot of people do. And it's very likely a losing proposition, because even if that player does have an excellent career, it doesn't mean their card's values are going to increase. Untapped potential and incredibly high expectations are baked into the starting value of young prospects' cards right from the start, because too many are approaching their cards with this same gambler's mindset. So much so that even if that player does succeed in their career and becomes an all-star or something, more likely than not, their cards still won't be able to maintain the really high starting point where their cards began at. A few will, and it is those who keep people gambling. A Giannis Antetokounmpo will come along once per generation and go from a late lottery pick to being the best player in the NBA. But for every Giannis that emerges, there's going to be hundreds more Sekou Doumbouya and Bol Bols, players whose cards will fall to almost completely valueless. And even for those who do become solidly good, like a John Collins, a Jaren Jackson Jr., or a DeAndre Hunter, it doesn't mean their cards will have any value on the sports card market. Only a very few hit that hobby relevance track and actually remain on it. Very, very few. Fantasy sports. For someone who loves fantasy sports, it's likely the love of the sport that keeps them interested. They enjoy digging into player stats and finding a good mix of sure things and players poised and ready to take that leap into being their best selves. They're looking for the underdog guys who are slightly under the radar but ready to explode. They're looking for good players on bad teams who will have impressive stats. None of these are mindsets that are going to help someone succeed in sports cards or in sports betting, but they're mindsets that will really help someone in fantasy sports. If someone approaches sports cards with these same mindsets, they'd likely end up with a big collection of solidly good role players more than anything else. They'd have a lot of cards from either really good players who don't have a lot of demand in the sports card market, like a Colin Sexton or a Bradley Beal, and they'd have a lot of cards from young players who may indeed be destined to be great, but whose cards are already way over the price they're likely to be at in the future, even if they do become perennial all-stars, like a LaMelo Ball, for example. Similarly, if someone approaches fantasy sports with a gambler's mentality, they'll likely fill up their team with players ready to pop off, only to discover halfway into the season that most of their players just didn't meet that expectation, and they find themselves in last place in their fantasy league. Sports betting. For someone who participates in sports betting of various kinds, most likely the motivation is financial in nature, and most likely it's rooted in a belief of their own sports knowledge. And very possibly, like most gambling is, it's also rooted in a desire to have that dopamine hit that comes from winning a bet or defeating the odds. Someone participating in sports betting doesn't hope to hold on to something tangible like a sports card, or do something that provides some ongoing fun like a fantasy team does. Their only aim really is to make cash. That's really about it. Now, if someone approaches sports cards with a sports betting mentality, they'll lose way more than they win. We've discussed this already. But what we haven't talked about is how prevalent this approach is in sports cards, and how much that has led to people losing a lot of money in sports cards. Participating in sports cards with a gambler's mentality is a quick route to loss. It's really tough to win that gamble. I'm a sports card guy. Fantasy sports are fun for me too, but in a shallower, kind of just for fun, here and there kind of way, and sports betting is something that I avoid completely. These personal approaches to how I engage in these spaces definitely influence the way I'm thinking about these things, so my thought process about all of this is not necessarily going to be shared by everyone, and that's okay. But that being said, I think it is important that we each have an understanding of what our own approach is in these spaces, and what the risks are associated with that particular kind of approach. If you find yourself involved in sports cards, but with a primarily gambler's mentality, and that is where you want to stay, so be it. You may lose money, but that's your choice. But just don't lose perspective that that is your choice. That's how you're choosing to engage with the hobby. That's not the nature of the hobby itself. The sports card hobby doesn't need to be a gamble. It only becomes one if you choose to approach it with that mindset.